Tonight, as you may know, the subject for our discussion is the death of the middle class. The economic statistics are staggering, and the personal stories of job loss, dislocation, and the loss of housing are emotionally devastating. What has been slowly developing for decades has now come to economic and political fruition. In the last 2 years, an economic perfect storm of massive job loss, overconsumption, and predatory loaning and investment schemes by American financial institutions has crippled the American economy and washed away the American middle class. And, most importantly, the American middle class, as we have known it for the last half-century, may not be coming back. Tonight, I want to do 3 things. First, I want to identify a few of the economic facts that characterize the new economic norm, and which are now reshaping the broader American social and political landscape. Second, I want to locate the origin and the death of the middle class in a broader historical and political philosophical perspective. Perhaps the most important thing to know about the middle class is that it is a quintessentially modern invention. As the philosophical ideas that created modernity continue to evolve and transform, so goes the middle class. I think it is essential to view the death of the middle class from this broader historical and political philosophical perspective. Doing so will allow us to get some purchase on what is really taking place and will hopefully allow us to respond to the collapse of the middle class in new and creative ways. Third, I will close with a few thoughts on where we go from here. We will then open the floor up for questions and discussions and a few drinks. 1. The economic facts that characterize the death of the middle class. I have chosen 3 economic indicators that I think best reveal the collapse of the middle class. These are by no means the only 3, and perhaps not even the most important, but they are the ones that captured my attention. In the past 5 years, we have witnessed the disappearance of a staggering amount of working class and middle class jobs. Since 2007, the American economy has lost over 8.7 million jobs. Over the last 12 months, 40% of the jobs were lost in, quote, higher wage industries. Since the slow recovery began, these formerly high-wage jobs represent only 14% of the jobs newly created. In 1970, 25% of all jobs in America were manufacturing. When you combine non-manufacturing middle-class jobs, white-collar middle-class jobs, you have a significant foundation of the American middle class. Today, only 9% of jobs in America are manufacturing. Since 2001, over 42,000 manufacturing facilities in the United States have been closed. As is common knowledge, these jobs were shipped to foreign markets where labor is significantly cheaper. The vast majority of new job creation that has occurred since the recovery has been in low-income service jobs. Minimum and low-income jobs represent 49% of new job creation. None of these jobs comes close to providing the sort of income necessary to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. And now, tragically, half of all American workers earn $505 or less a week. 2. The second economic fact contributing to the death of the middle class is the total stagnation of wages. Since 1980, the American economy has doubled in size and wealth. However, the average income for the American worker has remained virtually the same. In 1988, the income of the average worker was $33,400. According to the Department of Labor, after adjusted for inflation, the income for the average worker in 2008 was $33,000. Depending on how critical one wants to be, the argument could be made that the average worker, and by extension the middle class, actually lost economic and purchasing power in the last 30 years. For the last 30 years, 90% of America's wages have been stagnant. During this same time, the richest 1% of Americans, those making $380,000 or more a year, have seen their incomes grow by 33%. In the last 30 years, there has been a tremendous transfer of wealth from the middle class to the wealthy. One concrete example of this phenomenon, and one way of measuring the collapse of the middle class, is to look at the relationship between stagnant wages and college tuition, something very dear to the hearts of all of you. While wages have remained flat for 30 years, the cost of public universities have surged 130%. As most of you know, the middle class can no longer afford to send its children to college, and this only reinforces the downward trend of education and higher earning jobs. 3. The third economic factor is the total collapse of the housing market in the United States. The most recent blow to the middle class was the collapse in the housing market. If the middle class was one of the defining characteristics of the American dream, then home ownership was the foundation to the middle class. In 2010, nearly 3 million homes were in some form of foreclosure, and 2011 will be worse. In 2011, foreclosures have jumped 20%. As of now, approximately 5 million homeowners are currently in some state of foreclosure activity. In California, the number of homes repossessed by banks is up 52% just this year. Now, before I move on to a discussion of the political, philosophical forces contributing to the death of the middle class, I want to make clear what my position is on the current economic situation. The current economic recession and the death of the middle class is not just a particularly bad downturn in the American economy. What we are undergoing right now is not just a deep dip in the ebb and flow of markets and economic forces. What we are undergoing is a fundamental transformation in the American economy and moving into a stage of hyper-capitalism. As this transformation plays itself out in the next decade, the middle class may not come back. My second position. Despite what the Bush administration, then the Obama administration tried, we cannot spend our way out of this economic crisis. As many of you have heard me say in the past, you cannot solve the problems you face with the same thinking that created them. Paradoxically, one of the principal contributors to the collapse of the middle class was overconsumption and the manic need to sustain ever higher rates of consumption in the middle class. We cannot spend or buy our way into economic recovery. And 3, sadly, it is some of the very politicians and corporations that the middle class now looks to save them that are in fact a principal cause of the death of the middle class. What do I mean? It is a common myth in America that private industry will, sooner or later, come to the rescue of the middle class by creating high-wage jobs with benefits. This is not the case. Indeed, it is these very corporations that have targeted the middle class for elimination. And it is a common myth that politicians will save the middle class through economic policies and the maintenance of benefits. That is also becoming increasingly untrue. I will say more about these two factors in a few minutes. I would now like to turn to the political, philosophical forces driving the death of the middle class. Perhaps the most important thing to remember about the American middle class is that the American middle class is a quintessentially modern invention. The American middle class is the product of a specific set of philosophic, economic, and political ideas that are discovered in the early 1500s. The next important thing to remember about the middle class is that the middle class requires a specific geopolitical and economic space to exist and flourish. However, that space, that economic and political space, is now being transformed and undermined by the same ideas that created the middle class. There are three modern political, philosophical ideas that are caught up in the death of the middle class. They are: one, technology as a metaphysical tool to reveal the truth about capital markets and the distribution of resources. Two, the modern idea of happiness as the pursuit and acquisition of pleasure. And three, a view of economic and political life that views economic and political life as forms of legalized competition and combat. Let me begin with technology and the way technology has led to economic globalization and power. It should never be forgotten that the modern age began in the quest for exploration and the economic and political power exploration brought. What we now call globalization began with Magellan and Columbus and their search for economic and political glory. When Machiavelli famously declared that politics is about the acquisition and the maintenance of power, he initiated what would later become a political, then corporate competition for resources and wealth. Machiavelli inadvertently began the world historical phenomenon we now call globalization. Globalization began first with wooden ships and cannons, and it continues unabated today with microprocessors and multidimensional computing. Essential to Machiavelli's early modern conception of economic and political power was the emerging technology of the first wave of the scientific revolution. This technological revolution has continued unabated. It was technological superiority that allowed European exploration, colonization, and economic and political dominance. Technology was the tool used to conquer nature and people, and globalization was the political expression of the acquisition and the maintenance of power. From the 1800s onward, it was technological process and power that led to industrialization and manufacturing. It was the modern obsession with technology that created the material and economic foundation for what we now call the middle class. After World War II, it was the fusion of technological superiority and a unique geopolitical situation that allowed the American middle class to become the cultural phenomenon we know today. Underlying the secret power of technology, the seduction of technology, is the belief that technology and the scientific knowledge that drives it represents the metaphysical tool that will unlock the secrets of nature and reveal the truth about free market capitalism. Ultimately, it is this metaphysical dimension of technology, the belief that greater scientific and technological knowledge will reveal the truth about markets and profits, that may destroy the middle class. Let me give you a few examples. First, it was evolving forms of manufacturing technology that allowed corporations to locate their industrial facilities throughout the world. And this manufacturing technology was joined by increasing technological sophistication in communications, shipping, and logistics. The corporations were allowed to truly operate globally. Increasing technology allowed corporations to ship jobs overseas. As I cited earlier, in the 1970s, 25% of all jobs were middle-class manufacturing jobs. Now that number is 9%. Technology has fueled globalization, and globalization has helped dissolve the specific geopolitical space that the middle class requires to exist. Let me repeat. The American middle class requires a specific, protected geopolitical space. If this space is destroyed by the technological capacity of the multinational corporation, then the middle class will cease to exist. While economists who believe in the metaphysical truth of market capitalism claim that globalization is a good thing, and a good thing because it reveals the truth of labor and profit, globalization has, nonetheless, been a significant factor in the death of the middle class. According to the Commerce Department, from 1999 to 2009, U.S. multinational companies added 2.5 million employees overseas while cutting their domestic employees by 3 million. Globalization and greater competition drives wages down. Globalization is, therefore, a contributing factor to why jobs have disappeared and wages for the middle class have become stagnant. It is that simple. And I do not need to mention, as the statistics about the inequalities and the rates of wealth showed earlier, I do not need to mention that it is precisely those who benefit from the free flows of labor, capital, and technology that have profited the most. I will say more about this in a few minutes. Moreover, and equally important, it is not just on the international level that increasing technology is destroying the middle class. Increasing technology has allowed corporations to become incredibly efficient. Increasing technology has allowed corporations to do more and more and extract more and greater levels of profit with fewer workers. Companies are able to maintain and expand production without adding workers. According to the Commerce Department, the American economy has replaced only 1.8 million of the 8.7 million jobs lost. This is why, despite a small recovery and despite record profits by American corporations, there continues to be incredibly high rates of unemployment. This is what is called the jobless recovery. And as I cited earlier, the vast majority of jobs that have been created are low-income service jobs. This trend will only continue. I would now like to turn to the second modern political philosophical idea contributing to the death of the middle class. And this one is rather paradoxical. This one is genuinely counterintuitive. The second political philosophical idea contributing to the death of the middle class is the very modern idea that happiness is derived from pleasure, and pleasure is derived from acquisition and consumption. I have already mentioned Machiavelli's famous declaration made in 1525 that politics itself is nothing but the acquisition and the maintenance of power. 150 years later, another modern political philosopher named Thomas Hobbes would universalize Machiavelli's observation and forever change the way people live. In the 1650s, Thomas Hobbes overturned the classical Greek and Christian conception of happiness by bluntly saying, quote, "Happiness is not found in contentment. Happiness is not moral virtue. Happiness is not good character. Happiness," Hobbes argued, "is not a state of mind. It is not peace of the soul. Happiness is the endless desire to seek and acquire one pleasure after another. Happiness is the never-ending seeking and acquisition of things that make us feel good." This is the philosophical origin of the idea that the American middle class, as a class of consumers who are materially, physically, and emotionally happy. The American dream, for generations most symbolized by the prosperity of the middle class, has its very origin in the idea that happiness is connected to pleasure and pleasure is connected to consumption. There are two major problems with this conception of happiness. And it is these problems that have, paradoxically, undermined the very economic foundations of the middle class. As Hobbes states, this conception of happiness is driven by both the seeking and the acquisition of things that make us feel good. And, as he makes very clear, once we have acquired what we want, we grow restless for our next emotional and physical desire. Technically speaking, happiness is a never-ending movement of seeking and acquiring. The acquiring of one thing is just the jumping-off point for new forms of pleasure and happiness. It is this very idea, this revolution in the concept of happiness, that in many ways makes market capitalism possible. There is no modern capitalism without this revolution in the idea of happiness. Free market capitalism thrives on this notion of happiness as endless seeking of an acquisition of material things. Hobbes' notion of happiness makes us consumer and pleasure junkies. Now, the problem with this conception of happiness is that it requires ever-expanding domestic economies and ever-expanding wages and incomes to keep pace with the passion of desire and acquisition. People are happy as long as they have jobs, and their jobs continue to pay them well, so they can finance ever-expanding rates of consumption, so they can maintain their happiness. And, as we all know, for several generations, there was no happier group of people on planet Earth than the American middle class. For the happiness of the middle class to continue, the middle class must continue to increase its wages and rates of consumption. This puts incredible strain on domestic economies. And this brings us to the second problem with this conception of happiness. As I have already said, wages and incomes for the working class and the middle class have remained stagnant for the last 30 years. With stagnant incomes, but with ever expanding and never-ending desires to acquire more and more, how does the middle class remain happy? Debt. In the past 20 years, the American middle class has assumed trillions of dollars in housing and consumer debt. Borrowing has financed the maintenance of the American middle class conception of happiness. But now, the material and financial foundations to borrowing, ever-increasing wages, and real estate have disappeared. It is now impossible for the middle class to continue to borrow. With their wages flat and their capacity to borrow gone, the middle class shrinks and spends less and less. The American middle class is dying, made sick by flat wages, overconsumption, and debt. The modern idea of happiness inadvertently contributed to the American middle class, to the death of the American middle class. In addition, it is essential to note that when seen from the perspective of happiness, and happiness connected to pleasure and consumption, the American middle class is as much a psychological phenomenon as it is a material and economic condition. This is the most important point. The American middle class is as much a psychological phenomenon as it is an economic and material condition. Indeed, simply focusing on the material and economic conditions of the death of the middle class sort of misses an essential component of the crisis. As a psychological phenomenon, the American middle class is characterized by a state of mind with respect to pleasure and consumption. as the capacity for the middle class to consume and therefore experience happiness declines, it is no accident that most Americans today are very, very unhappy. It is no accident that in free market capitalist systems, we call downturns in the economy depressions. I would now like to turn to the third modern political philosophical idea contributing to the death of the middle class. I call this the realist view of economic and political relations as forms of legalized combat. These last observations are, to be sure, the most controversial, but I believe them to be true, so I will speak about them. Americans tend to be very idealistic about their founding generation, and they tend to imbue the founding generation and the American Republican experiment in general with inherent moral qualities. Generally speaking, Americans tend to trust their politicians, and they tend to trust their corporations, and they remain idealistic about the virtue of American politics. And while some of this is no doubt rooted in historical truth and experience, this idealism conceals from view a darker, more aggressive, more self-interested dimension to American economic and political relations. Lurking in the shadows of American exceptionalism is a darker side of American economic and political life. And it is this darker side that is contributing to the death of the American middle class. In addition to declaring that the purpose of politics is the acquisition and the maintenance of power, Machiavelli also famously declared that politics has nothing to do with morality, and it has nothing to do with the cultivation of moral virtue in its citizens, be they corporate or private. Indeed, Machiavelli argued that given the way the world really is, and given the way people really are, the effective ruler will be by necessity compelled to use craft and deceit, manipulation, and even violence in order to maintain political power. For the aristocratic Machiavellian ruler, for the aristocratic Machiavellian prince, citizens are both the foundation for and the target for their power. And while Hobbes cunningly asserted that all men were created equal, thereby providing the foundation to later Locke and Jefferson's famous claims, he meant by that term, all men are created equal, that men were equal in their natural vulnerability to a violent death, most likely at the hands of his or her neighbor. While men are naturally equal in their vulnerability to death, Hobbes declared, they are radically unequal in all other ways. Indeed, Hobbes seems to claim that naturally occurring inequality of intellect, strength, cunning, wit, and talent is the defining characteristic of the order of things. However, Hobbes was no idiot. He understood perfectly well that in the absence of the safety created by the law and the sword, natural superiority, natural inequality in intelligence, strength, wit, cunning was worthless. For the naturally superior to express and profit from their talent, they needed to be protected in a political arena. Therefore, for Hobbes, politics is actually the artificial space created in order for the naturally superior to thrive and dominate their less equals. Combining Machiavelli's classical elitism with Hobbes's notion of politics as the artificial space created so inequality can thrive, I want to suggest that for ambitious, intelligent, and creative individuals, the middle class has been both the foundation for and the target of their economic and political power. The middle class is the site of intellectual, economic, and political combat. The darker side of the modern view of economic and political association views these relationships as forms of legalized combat. Make no mistake about it. Here, the acquisition and the maintenance of economic and political power are the guiding principles. And the middle class is either an instrument to that end, or, as the case is now, tragically, an obstacle to that end. In the last 30 years, and especially in the last decade, the driving force behind the death of the middle class has come from the very corporate and political institutions the middle class has always believed would sustain and protect them. For example, as we have already discussed, for the last 30 years, corporations have mercilessly pursued profit through the maximization of technology and the outsourcing of jobs. The principal target of greater efficiency in outsourcing was the middle class. For the last 30 years, corporate America has consciously and deliberately targeted the American middle class for elimination. More recently, we have seen a total corporate assault on labor unions. Labor unions have been the legal and political foundation for the maintenance and the growth of the middle class. But in the last decades, corporations have specifically targeted labor unions in a war of economic and political combat. And given the ever-increasing threat of and movement towards globalization, it was an economic and political war the labor unions could not possibly win. We must be very clear. Corporate America has consciously waged war on the legal and the political foundations of the American middle class. Lately, this corporate warfare on the middle class has found a new ally in the political powers of America. Michigan and North Carolina are good examples of, quote, right-to-work states that are union-free. What middle-class jobs remain in these states exist at diminished and stagnant wage levels. In addition to the corporate assault on the middle class, there is now the political crisis of massive state and federal budget deficits. Facing massive and potentially crippling debt, both states and the federal government are slashing spending. As states and the federal government slash spending, they eliminate the white-collar side of the American middle class, and they eliminate the benefits and the Social Security networks that sustain the working and middle class. State and local governments currently employ 19 million Americans. As governments continue to slash spending, just this year we expect to lose 2 million jobs. Again, many of these jobs are the white-collar side of the American middle class. We now have a perfect storm of economic and political warfare being waged on the American middle class. Corporate America has convinced Washington, D.C. to lower their taxes and deregulate their operating environments, while state and federal governments eliminate white-collar middle-class jobs. This perfect storm of economic and political combat against the middle class helps explain the staggering inequality of wealth that has now opened up between the average American in the middle and working class and the 1% of this society that owns 90% of its wealth. Indeed, this is exactly what you would expect from a fusion of Machiavellian elitism and Hobbesian politics. This is no accident. And yet, middle-class Americans continue to hold on to the delusion that their corporate masters will create jobs for them and that their political representatives will protect them. The middle class does not understand that they are the targets of and the unwitting combatants in an economic and political war for the acquisition and the maintenance of power. So where do we go from here? I think the first thing to emphasize, again, is that the American middle class is a rather unique historical, economic, psychological, and political invention. A very specific set of philosophical, economic, technological, and political forces were necessary to create the middle class. However, the world historical forces that align to create and for a while sustain the middle class no longer exist in the way that they used to. The middle class is a uniquely modern invention, but the world is now moving into a phase of hyper-capitalism and postmodern politics. One of the main dangers to the American middle class is that they do not understand this. The American middle class holds on to the belief that their standard of living and their material security and comfort somehow represent the truth about the rational and economic evolution of humanity. But the American middle class is simply an idea forged in a unique world historical moment. So what can be done? First, in some ways, the death of the middle class is a liberating thing. The death of the middle class forces us to confront our idea of happiness and what is important in life. It is also a liberating thing from an existential point of view. The death of the middle class frees individuals to become creative in their dreams and in their aspirations. In many ways, because the dream of the middle class was so seductive, it lured many people into a sort of existential, emotional, and political hibernation. However, immense opportunity now exists. Never has there been a better time in 4,000 years of human life for creativity, entrepreneurship, and personal power in the history of humanity. The same technological forces that are destroying the middle class also enable an individual to create, launch, and run a company from his or her own iPhone. Never in 4,000 years of recorded human history has there been such an opportunity for human genius, for human creativity, for human autonomy, for human freedom. Now is the time to be creative. Now we will really see this claim of American exceptionalism put to the test. For centuries, you have heard the claim, American exceptionalism in morality, American exceptionalism in creativity and manufacturing. Now we will see that claim to American exceptionalism truly put to the test. How truly exceptional are Americans? Second, if we as a people decide that we want the middle class to continue, and that of course is a political discussion we must have as a nation, and if we agree that we want the middle class to remain in this world, the middle class must fight for its existence. The American middle class must assume a combat footing. The American middle class must assume a combat footing against their corporate masters and their political representatives. Their trust in their corporate masters and their political leaders is partly their undoing. Nothing other than radical economic and political disruption will get the attention of corporate America and politicians. The question is, does the American middle class have the strength and the stomach for this? We'll now open it up to questions and answers and discussions.